We have changed the schedule up a little bit, so we're going to take the reappointments first. And with that, the first reappointment is Taylor Height. He's a member of the State Banking Board. The reappointments do not have to attend, do not have to be here. So are there any questions about Mr. Height? Senator Masters?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, if you're amenable on the reappointments, and if there's not anything in particular, I'd yield to the rest of the committee, but I would be amenable to making a motion that we would accept the appointment of all the reappointments in one block motion, if you're amenable to that.
Thank you. Is there a second of that motion? Seconded by, is made by Senator Masterson and seconded by Senator Seitz, that we take all of the reappointments at one time. Is there any discussion on that motion? Seeing none, vote on that motion to take them all at one time. Aye? Okay. Okay, so now we'll take all the reappointments at one time. The motion did pass. So reappointments of the 7, Taylor Height, Margaret LaRue, Irvin Mitchell, David Moses, Crystal Watson, Leonard Wolf, and Richard Salmoningo. Are there any questions? All in favor of these reappointments, say aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you very much. That takes care of our reappointments. Now we'll move on to our new appointees. The first one is the appointment of Herbert Imes for the State Banking Board. Would you come forward, please?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Herbert Imes, native Kansas, born and raised here in Topeka. Graduated from Topeka High in 1970 and Washington in 74. Married in 75 and had two kids in Kansas and unfortunately in Texas. I began my work in the insurance industry when I was 19 while going to Washington and the insurance agency here in Topeka. After I graduated, I stayed there for about 3 years, a little over 3 years, and then worked for 2 different insurance companies, traveling the state, calling on insurance agents around the state. And then in 1982, I went to work for the Kansas Bankers Association to oversee their insurance operation and call on banks around the state. And did that for 37 years. And in doing that, I gained a lot of knowledge in how banks operate,
Well, thank you very much. Any questions? Senator Wilburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for being here. Could you tell me what coverages you were responsible for? It was the bond, E&O?
bond, D&O, property and casualty.
Could you turn your mic on up there? Thank you.
And also the employee benefits side. We had KBA has a large health insurance operation and other benefits. So
Thank you.
work with that.
Any other questions? Yes, Senator Seitz.
Thank you for being here and thank you for being willing to serve. I too believe in the community banker, and I just know as technology and things, what do you see like, how do we continue to build on that community banker? Like, I can deposit all of my things, I go for loans, but just trying to bring the younger generation to kind of back to that relationship with your banker.
It's difficult, as you've seen. When I started with the KBA in '82, we had 631 banks. And I was talking to the commissioner a little bit ago, and we're down to 166 state banks, and I think we have 30 national banks. And in many of our banks, the bankers are aging out. And so you're right, we need to focus on getting younger people involved, bringing them into the banks. And we have many communities that can still support a standalone community bank. You just have to visit with the people in that community and get them interested. And I saw it many times over the years where a community had come together, and when the ownership got old, frankly, and wanted to sell, the community would get together and buy the bank. And I'd like to encourage more and more of that. But that is the big challenge that we have. And Kansas has more community banks than I think all but 5 other states. And I'd like to see us maintain that.
Any other questions? Seeing none, I would entertain a motion to move Herbert Imes, member of the State Banking Board, to the full Senate for consideration. Motion been made by Senator Masterson. Do I have a second? Second by Senator Wilburn. All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Motion carried. Thank you very much. We appreciate you being here today. Thank you. We'll move on to our next appointee is Carrie Leonard, from the nominee for the Kansas Child Advocate, Office of the Child Advocate, and appointment to serve according to legislation. It says 5 years. We also know that the legislation is incorrect and will have to be fixed in the 2025 session. So with that, welcome to the committee.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Vice Chair, and Ranking Member, and members of the committee. I'm grateful for this opportunity to stand before you in support of my appointment for the position of the Child Advocate with the new Independent Office of the Child Advocate. So my name is Carrie Leonard, and I stand before you today as a wife of 23 years, as a mother of 2 sons, and a lifelong Midwesterner. Graduated from high school from Olathe South High School. Didn't go too far from home to attend the University of Kansas, where I earned my Bachelor of Social Work, and then went on to earn my Master of Social Work from the Washburn University. I worked as a school social worker for 5 years in an educational setting, and as my time as a social worker, also wore a number of different hats. Worked as a social work PRN, as a foster care case manager, worked as an attendant care worker at a community mental health center, and also worked with women and children at a safe shelter who were survivors of intimate partner violence. After listening to what I would say many a monologue about needs of families and the need to access legal advocacy, my spouse and best champion encouraged me to go to law school. He also said, either go or quit talking about it. So I decided to take the plunge and pursued my law degree. So attended Washburn University School of Law, graduating with Dean's Honors and earning my Certificate of Family Law. My devotion to child welfare has been longstanding, as you can see, as my career path has shown. And I believe strongly in access to the judicial process, quality, legal representation, and child welfare best practices, as well as prevention and upstream efforts. It has been an honor, and I have appreciated the opportunity and chance to serve and have a statewide impact over the last several years, and to build those relationships and the momentum for systemic change. Prior to my appointment as the child advocate with the division, I came to that role after being employed with Kansas Legal Services, first as a staff attorney and then as a managing attorney of the Kansas Legal Services Topeka office. For those of you who aren't necessarily familiar, Kansas Legal Services is the nonprofit legal aid of Kansas, providing equal access to justice for our most vulnerable Kansans. And as a proud member of that team since 2007. And in that role, I gained extensive litigation experience in legal issues and barriers faced by our indigent individuals, with an emphasis in child welfare as a guardian ad litem, representing parents, interested parties, and juvenile defense attorney. Managed a number of different roles with Kansas Legal Services as a staff attorney and managing attorney, including leadership roles within the organization as a staff association representative and staff association vice president. As a managing attorney, I provided direct supervision for our attorneys and our paralegals, as well as managed a variety of different funding sources and grants for the organization. Throughout my tenure there, provided legal education and training for child welfare partners across the state on legal topics and best practices. And I remain an active contributor and member of the Citizens Review Panels and Children's Justice Act Task Force, and a former member of the Kansas Supreme Court Task Force on Permanency. Both of those task forces are chartered with reviewing child welfare processes and procedures in child need of care cases, providing recommendations for best practices to our welfare partners, agencies, the courts, and identifying training needs and facilitating those opportunities. In my present role, I am a member of the CanLink Steering Committee, which is currently working to ensure access to an interconnected network of early care and education systems to support and help children in Kansas thrive in their communities. So when I spoke earlier about feeling strongly about preventative and upstream efforts, that's one of those efforts that's happening here in Kansas right now. I also serve on the Family First in Kansas Strong Statewide Interagency Advisory Board. My commitment and experience and devotion to children and families, along with my guardian ad litem work, I believe makes me an ideal candidate for this position, as well as my present experience in this role. I believe that provides me a unique opportunity to bridge the transition seamlessly from the Division of the Child Advocate now to the new Independent Office of the Child Advocate. And I'm proud of the foundational framework that we built over the last couple of years and would be honored to continue to carry that torch. The last 2.5 years have been monumental, building a new division, and I think, again, building with under the new legislation, building that from that new foundation. But this would not have happened without a pretty amazing and committed team that has been working diligently in the last couple of years, and their support and commitment, and they bring comprehensive expertise. I think also in my role, forging those relationships with all three branches of our government, particularly with our Joint Committee on Child Welfare System Oversight and our other partners across the state. We're often asked what kind of impact we think we've had over the last couple of years, and that's a challenging question to answer because it can be measured in very difficult, like small incremental ways. So. We believe that even just improved communication can make a difference in a child and family's case. A challenging case team and provider thought processes and practices to advocate for a change in the trajectory of the case, as well as the issuance of 2 special reports that our office has issued, as well as our annual reports. The ability to develop in the expanded leadership role on a statewide level is a tremendous opportunity and honor, and I believe that my professional training and experience combined with my passion and dedication makes me an ideal candidate for this position moving forward. And I thank you for your time and consideration this afternoon, and I'm happy to stand for questions.
Senator Masterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Carrie, for being here. Obviously, this issue is very important to me personally. So I think I have a series of questions for you. I do think you're in a unique position, having seen what you've seen and been where you've been. Your resume speaks for itself as qualified. The very fact we live in a broken world, broken people. So I think your role is probably one of the most important roles we have in government. And that was why we why we passed a bill to make this role independent. And so, and duly very powerful, right? You have, because I've been here long enough, probably, I don't know, fortunately or unfortunately, to see tragic cases under every party, every governor, right? I mean, I don't care if you're Republican or Democrat, but what I also noticed was, and I'm not faulting anybody, but due to self-preservation, people tend to hide those types of failings or mistakes, right, that are made. You want to whitewash your own administration and your agencies to try to preserve, and that's why it needed to be independent. And it's happened under both. I mean, so I'm really interested in, probably my number one question for you is, do you feel comfortable pushing back against an administration that appointed you or you served? I think you understand what I'm asking, right? We're giving you independence for a reason, giving this office independence, because these cases, and I have a few I'd like to just ask you about, but do you feel comfortable or confident in your ability to do that, number one?
Senator, I appreciate the question, and I think you're right. It's an extremely critical role, and our legislature took a long time to make sure that they were able to really work out, I think, a solid bill to move forward and ensure the independence of the office. Number one, I think that being in this role is an honor, and it's a lot of responsibility, and there is a lot of power there. Do I feel confident or comfortable pushing back when needed? I do, and I hope that my experience and my passion and my work ethic and really what I have believed in for all these years as an attorney and as an advocate, as a social worker, hopefully in some ways can speak for itself, that when necessary, I will push back. I also believe strongly that in order to have system impactful change, we want to support those who are in this work, that it's challenging work, it's hard and it's messy. And so I think that in this role, it's also important that we're standing with folks next to them and encouraging best practices. And we often, when we're talking with folks in our investigations, my team will share with them that that doesn't mean that we're not going to ask the hard questions, that we're not going to highlight those areas that need improvement or where there's been mistakes that have been made, and making sure that hopefully we're preventing that in the future. I think that this new bill provides some additional tools in our toolbox to do that. And in particular, I think it creates a clear pathway, and I think I shared this with your assistant, a clear pathway to provide referrals to the additional referrals to law enforcement for investigation if we identify that there's a need for that, as well as the appropriate office within the Attorney General's office. That was not necessarily clear before, and so I think those are important pathways that are clear now.
It's my next one. I'm just looking at your report from 2023. Just kind of real, I like to kind of the Paul Harvey rest of the story. I want to know if what's happening is actually, so there was one case, the child, a newborn, unnecessarily removed from young parents, and that was in your report. I'm trying to go to things that I know you'd be familiar with. What happened with that? Was the child returned? Was there disciplinary action? What was the real world result of that, of your recommendations? And am I asking too specific of a case?
Probably asking too specific of a case for us to be able to share publicly, but I'll
rephrase then, because I wanted to know, what are your recommendations leading to are there, when someone's a bad actor, is there a disciplinary action? Have you referred anything to law enforcement? Is there real change in the agency? The real impetus for giving the power to that office is to create real practical change when you see something like that.
Thank you for the question. So, Senator, when you ask about particular change, so under our executive order, when we were in a case and we were advocating, we oftentimes worked with case teams, with supervisors, with leadership to challenge decisions, to challenge, like I said, a particular trajectory in a case, to make change in that. When it came to formal recommendations, we requested agency responses, whether they agreed with our recommendations, whether they intended to implement particular changes. Sometimes they agreed with us and provided specific action that were going to be taken. That included changing in policy. That included particular training that they were going to initiate in order to address a concern. There were instances where it included discipline in regards to a particular worker and their actions under a progressive discipline plan, as well as working with leadership around whether any legislative changes needed to occur. Under the new legislation, I think that it's spelled out even more specifically. So under the new legislation, we're able to very specifically state what under our recommendations verbiage, one of those including requesting that the agency does respond, provide a response to our recommendations and whether or not they plan to implement change. And so I think with that additional language, we'll be able to track even more specifically some of those things that you're asking about.
Have you seen any instance through complaint or otherwise that has risen to the level of engaging law enforcement at this point?
Not that we have initiated, Senator, at this point.
So, because I'm thinking specifically about, the case that wasn't that long ago, the 5-year-old girl there in Topeka. It was reported publicly that there were, I can't remember, 9 opportunities of engagement from the agency. What reaches that level for you that you would, what level of complaint? Let me ask 2 layers to that. Does there have to be a complaint from the public for you to investigate? Do you feel like, I want this new office to be proactively seeking the betterment of the conditions of the children, number 1. And 2, so do you have to have a complaint, or can you be proactively? And 2, what level of complaint or issue you find would rise to the level of engaging law enforcement?
So to make sure I understand the question, so the first one is, can we initiate a particular investigation and be proactive? So the bill, so I wasn't prepared necessarily to quote the new legislation or bill, but if I recall, it does specifically say that we're to act on complaints that are received.
So do you feel that's a new power that you didn't have prior?
To act on complaints that were received?
To proactively initiate an investigation?
Well, no, I don't know that the new bill actually states that clearly. So if I read it, and I would have to pull it out, I believe that the new legislation states that the office is to act on complaints that are received. That may include then identifying patterns and things like that. If we identify patterns of practice based on a complaint, or we feel like we need to look further into the situation and expand that scope, I believe that there's grounds or authority to do that. But I don't think that it clearly states that we can proactively just initiate
We might have work to do.
investigation. And yeah, and there may be some language that we can.
Law enforcement?
And as far as the law enforcement, so I think it's a matter of, are law enforcement already involved or not? So there are situations that we've looked at where when we started looking and investigating the situation, law enforcement were already involved in looking at situations. If we believe that it rose to the level where there were potentially criminal actions or criminal activity occurring, then we have the ability to work with the Attorney General's office then to identify the law enforcement agency that would be appropriate to investigate that, as well as to the Attorney General's office.
Thank you for indulging me, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Any other questions? Senator Petty.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks so much for being here. So with with the legislation and putting in place the Office of the Child Advocate, what do you then, following up on the questions that came from the President of the Senate, what do you perceive then to, do you see that this is bringing to a higher level are the issues that we have dealing with children in the state of Kansas, particularly when it comes to protection of their ability to be in a safe, growing environment?
So Senator, to make sure I understand the question, you're asking whether the new independent office then would elevate or bring those concerns. I absolutely believe that that's the case. I believe that if our office is involved and we're pursuing an investigation, then we have the ability to not only bring it to investigate the case as it's going along and work to hopefully make sure that best practices are happening, but then elevate it within the administration, as well as within our legislature, and if it's necessary, then take a next step further if other investigative bodies need to be involved. So I do think that it does elevate the issues and the concerns, hopefully in a way that will ensure that our children and families are safe.
Just a follow-up question, do you see then, are you hopeful that there will be a better alignment of services then that are, when it comes to protecting the rights of our children?
Yes. So, a better alignment of services. I think Senator Alley, it was a question that he had actually posed when we spoke, which was, what is something that was one of the biggest surprises that you had in your role in the last couple of years? And I wasn't quite sure how to answer that. And it took me a moment and, had been talking even with my team a little bit. And as we were thinking about it, one of the biggest surprises, and I knew that there were differences across the state. I knew that services look very different depending on where we're located, whether it's urban, rural, frontier. But even within each of those areas, things look different. I think to the extent that they are different was a surprise and continues to be a surprise. How people access those services, how policies and procedures are interpreted and responded to. So I do hope that with our involvement, we can be a part of that puzzle and those solutions to hopefully then better align and ensure that all of our families across the state and all of our children across the state are accessing those services.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? Senator Bellinger.
Thank you, and thank you for being here today. Will your office have anything to do with foster care?
Yes.
Okay, so do you have any ideas on how we fix our foster care system? I mean, it's a complete failure here in Kansas.
Thank you, Senator. How to fix foster care. So that's one of those questions that I think so many different groups are talking about. And again, I hope that this office can be a part of that solution. When you say how to fix foster care, was in a meeting Friday and I used this description. So I'm going to use it today because it was a way I think about it. I think about one of those plastic toys they're all linked together, and you have to put pressure on all the different points to slowly shrink it and address it in order to make a smaller, essentially, version of itself. And I don't remember what the toy is called. I can picture it. But when we think about fixing foster care, I think it's going to take tackling it at every different point. So when I think about one point, I mentioned prevention services or upstream efforts. I think we have to be looking at when we can connect with children and families early on in a protective factor to hopefully reduce that number of children that are entering care and not have to experience the trauma of foster care. I think we have to tackle it on the other end. We have a lot of youth that are spending long periods of time in foster care and finding solutions for them and making sure that they're getting the services that they need. And then if it is necessary for a child to enter care, then really making sure that we have a robust system of services that is going to meet those children's needs. And so I think it's going to take a lot of different efforts at a lot of different points to address the concern.
One additional question I guess I would like to know was, I've been involved in a couple of different cases through my years here, and it seems like if there's a case of
accusations of child abuse or something, it's like sometimes in the cases I've been involved in, they've been removed from the family, and you prove that it didn't happen. You know, that the parents are guilty, and they have to prove that something didn't happen. Is that something that your office will, I mean, I know you're going to focus on the children, but it seems to me like, and sometimes I get calls and have to get involved because, you know, there's grandparents there that could take care of these children and know they want to take them and send them to another county somewhere with, you know, a foster home. I just think those type things need to be improved on. And I don't know if you have any ideas on how we can improve those situations.
So those are the types of concerns that our office receives quite often, whether it's around the grounds for the removal itself or around placement, and whether grandparents have been given the substantial consideration that they're supposed to be given as far as placement. And we know that if children are removed from their parents, that being placed with kin or someone that they're connected to is better for them. It reduces the trauma. It also increases the likelihood of that family reunifying. So those are absolutely the concerns that our office receives, and we hope that the earlier we receive those concerns, and the more responsive then we can be in working with whether it's DCF or the foster care contractor around those decisions and challenging questions. Was policy and procedure followed? What are the concerns around placement? Did they provide adequate consideration? And so really asking those questions around those case decisions.
Thank you.
Yes. Senator Sykes?
Hi, thank you for being here and thank you for reaching out earlier. My question, and I know this has evolved over the 2 years and now that it's in statute, a little more security in the position. But do you feel that you will be equipped with, as you're seeing things that we need to make policy decisions, that you can come to us and kind of giving those best practices based on what you've learned in the last 2 years, in the next coming years, of things that we can better align and legislative action that may be needed? Do you feel like you have that authority?
I do, yes, Senator. I believe that in fact, I think it's an important, when we think about advocating for children and families, I think that's a necessary authority or piece of this office, is that it's important that we're looking at policies and practices and procedures as well as legislation and how that's impacting those services. And so I think it's an important role of this office to make sure that I'm working with the legislature, that this office is working with the legislature to make those changes and make recommendations.
Are there any other questions? I have one. You were appointed in December of 21, and you've been in there almost 3 years, perhaps. Being appointed, and then after we passed Senate Bill 115, which created this position, what has changed in that office?
Thank you for the question, Senator. So from a day-to-day perspective, not a lot has changed because we're trying to make sure that we are continuing to provide seamless services to those who are bringing concerns to our office. Things that will change moving forward. Number one is when we're looking at the scope of the office, it does expand it to include those youth that are receiving or have received services from KDOC in the last 5 years. So it does, we are looking at, as concerns are coming to our office, we're looking at that scope question. Number two, some things that have changed will be the nature of our recommendations. I think, as I noted before, there's specific language within the legislation in regards to the types of recommendations that we can make. So we'll see some changes there. In regards to being able to operate independently, I've been working with the Department of Administration to work with our personnel services to figure out an MOU so that we can continue to provide those support services for the independent office. as well as I've had some initial conversations with the Attorney General's office in regards to those support services that are outlined within the bill itself, as well as with KDOC.
Are there any other questions on this? If there are no further questions, I will entertain a motion to move this committee to recommend favorably to the Senate pursuant to state statutes and amendment. And the reason that language is we want to make sure the language is correct when we put it into, or change that statute. So do I have that motion? Motion made by Senator Masterson. Do I have a second? Seconded by Senator Petty. All in favor? Opposed? Yes. Yes.
So in your motion, are you referring to the number of years?
Number of years, and yes, I think that's the one of the things we want to make sure that is correct when we get it into statute. Because right now,
We already have it in statute.
it's incorrect in statute.
So you're talking about an amendment or a bill to amend the statute for the
That's
length of
correct.
time.
That's correct.
Thank you.
So we'll correct it. Yes.
Just
Senator
to
Seitz.
clarify then, it would be favorably for the 4 years, but I think the date in which
We want to
that start would be, but it would be for 4 years.
make sure that we get that corrected in statute.
Thank
you. Okay. Other questions? Been moved and seconded, and we did vote on it. Is this correct?
No, we didn't vote.
We didn't vote yet? Okay, we will now. So all in favor? Aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carried. Thank you very much. We appreciate that. Okay, moving on. Our next conferee would be Colonel Schneider. And to introduce Colonel Schneider, we would like to invite Brigadier General Veretti to the stand and to introduce Colonel Schneider. Welcome.
Chairman, members of the committee, good afternoon, and thank you for allowing me to introduce a great American, and that is Colonel Paul Schneider. And so I've known him for several years. He currently acts as the Director of the Joint Staff, and perhaps more importantly, he serves as your Deputy Adjutant General. He's been doing so for about 18 months now. Years ago, a colonel asked me when I was Lieutenant Colonel what my job was, and I learned a lot from my answer. I went into what I thought was an eloquent response to a simple question, and it turns out I was wrong. He said, Lieutenant Colonel Venerdi, the correct answer is I need you to make good decisions. So that hasn't changed. So that was an incredible moment in my life for mentorship. I'll tell you, I expect the same things from our General Officer Corps. On top of making good decisions, I expect integrity above reproach. I'll tell you that Paul Schneider is both. Senator, you asked a question earlier to somebody previously about would they be able to disagree with leaders? I stand here in front of you proudly telling you that Paul does, and I love it. He provides me great counsel. He is a man of a strong opinion, and I think our Adjutant General's department is better when we disagree. And so thank you for the opportunity to introduce a great American, Colonel Paul Schneider, for his first star as Brigadier General, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Welcome.
Mr. Chairman, Vice Chair, members of the committee, I'm Colonel Paul Schneider, and I'd like to thank you for taking the time to conduct this confirmation hearing for my appointment to Brigadier General in the Kansas National Guard. It's an honor to be standing before you today. I'd also like to thank Governor Kelly and General Venerdi for nominating me and having the trust and confidence to continue serving. And General Venerdi, thank you for taking the time to introduce me today and for your leadership and mentorship that you provide our great organization. I'd like to first begin by recognizing my family. First and foremost, my wife, Terry, who's here with us today. Thank you for being here as well. And my daughter, Sydney, who could not be here with us today. She resides in the other Manhattan, in Manhattan, New York, which she moved to when she graduated and after graduating from Kansas State in 2018. I want to take this time to thank them for all that they do, for their continued support to me over the years. I'm truly blessed to have them in my life. For a little background on myself, I am a native Kansan. I was born and raised on a farm between Highland and Troy, Kansas, overlooking the Missouri River. My father raised cattle and farmed, and my mother helped with the farming operation as well as raising us kids. That upbringing taught me the value of hard work. After graduating from high school at Highland, Kansas, I later graduated from Kansas State University. The Kansas National Guard was and has been instrumental in shaping me as a young adult who no doubt needed further development. I enlisted as a junior in high school and was fortunate to serve with some of the best non-commissioned officers a young soldier could ask for. Through their mentorship and guidance, I was later able to attend and commission through the Officer Candidate School in December of 1994. From there, I became a Field Artillery Officer, attending the Field Artillery Officer Basic Course in Fort Sill, Oklahoma the following summer. And in the fall of 1997, I accepted a full-time position with the Kansas Army National Guard, and I remain in that capacity today, serving in a general officer billet as a director of Joint Staff. I've had the greatest jobs in the Army, commanding soldiers at the battalion, or the battery, the battalion, and the brigade levels, both at home and forward deployed overseas. My last deployment was serving with the 130th Field Artillery Brigade as we deployed to the Middle East to serve as the Army's Central Command's Force Field Artillery Headquarters, supporting 3 named operations, Spartan Shield, Inherent Resolve, and Resolute Support, which at the time spanned 8 different countries, and I commanded both active duty and reserve component soldiers. These experiences fine-tuned my acumen for the National Guard's federal mission of fighting and winning our nation's wars. During my career, I've also had the great pleasure of supporting the National Guard's primary mission of civil support to responding to the needs of the Kansas citizens. I served as the agency's lead for 38 months as the Director of Military Support, working with our Kansas Division of Emergency Management. During that time, we assisted the citizens of the great state of Kansas during response and recovery operations for tornadoes, flooding, winter storms, and wildfires. And then through the Emergency Mutual Aid Compact, I also assisted with deploying forces to other states to help their citizens in time of need as well. So the leadership of this agency has invested 37 years developing me with leadership opportunities and education to get me where I am today. Humbly, I believe I am more than ready to be appointed Brigadier General in the Kansas National Guard, but I also did not get here alone. I can truly say that I stand on the shoulders of giants, the officers, non-commissioned officers, and soldiers that I've had the great pleasure to serve with the past 37 years. They're an inspiration to me that enables me to continue serving today. I look forward to building the readiness and developing leaders of the organization. I pride myself in mentoring and leading our young servicemen and women, and I do not take that role lightly. Parents trust us to mold and mentor their sons and daughters into highly trained and responsible servicemen, men and women, in an environment where they are treated with dignity and respect. I look forward to continuing to serve the men and women of the Kansas National Guard, the state of Kansas, and our nation, and I'm proud to serve this great organization and would be humbled to continue serving as a general officer. Thank you for your time and consideration, and I stand by for questions the committee may have.
Thank you very much, Colonel. We appreciate that. Are there any questions, Colonel? Yes, Senator Petty.
Well, thank you very much for being here, and thank you for your service over the years. I just thought it was interesting as I read your information that you provided us that you had a kind of colorful youth. And I just wondered if you see this as being an asset when you look at the young people that come into the National Guard.
Absolutely. I take that experience as a youth and growing up. As I said, my testimony probably needed a little bit more development growing up, but certainly got that from the organization, and that's how I lead today. I look at each and every soldier that we have in our formation as they have problems, or even hopefully before they have issues, and just talk with them and mentor, coach, and teach them as they go through their issues. And our soldiers and airmen, like the local populace, has issues just like they do. So I appreciate that question, Senator.
Thank you.
Senator Wilburn.
Just one closing comment. A gentleman once told me it takes a wild colt to make a good horse, so you hang in there.
Thank you, Senator.
With that thought, is there any other comments? If not, well, thank you very much for your service. We do appreciate that. And at this time, we'll ask for a motion. Motion to approve. Second by Senator Seitz. A motion made by Senator Masterson. All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Motion carried. Thank you very much. We appreciate your service.
Thank you for the opportunity to
Thank
testify.
you. Next, we'll move on to the nominee for the Secretary of Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks, Christopher Kennedy. Would you give us a little background, sir?
Yes, sir. Good afternoon. Thank you all for having me today, Mr. Chairman, Vice Chair, Ranking member, and members of the committee. I'd also like to thank my family and friends for attending this confirmation and supporting me. They truly are valuable to me, and I appreciate their continued support. My name is Christopher Kennedy, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to appear before you in support of my appointment to the position of Secretary of the Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks. I originally grew up in St. Louis, Missouri. My family owned a construction company, so thus, as you can imagine, even as a child, I was no stranger to hard work. My family were also avid hunters, anglers, and boaters. I was bitten by the outdoor bug at a very young age. As a child, I enjoyed many days outdoors and would spend as much time as possible on my grandfather's farm in Arkansas. In my youth, I realized that hard work was a necessity, but I wanted to find a career that I could truly be passionate about. Right out of high school, I began an internship program with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. During the next 5 years, I assisted researchers with conducting projects that related to water quality, fish community monitoring, fish nutrition, and hatchery production. A large portion of this research was conducted right here in Kansas. The professor that introduced me into this field was our very own Dr. William G. Lair from Milford, Kansas. Dr. Lair worked for the Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. He not only taught me his craft, but he also fine-tuned my skills as a hunter, a trapper, and an angler. While conducting fish surveys on the Delaware River near Houghton, I realized that I wanted to spend the rest of my career in natural resource conservation. This great profession initially called to me right here in Kansas. After advancing in the field for the last 33 years, I remain dedicated to serving fish, wildlife, and people. I view coming back to Kansas as my career coming full circle. My education consists of a degree in fisheries biology from the University of Arkansas. As a fisheries management biologist in Missouri, I worked with private landowners, managed public resources, researched and restored rare swamp endemic species such as the alligator gar, initiated youth work programs, and conducted many educational programs and landowner workshops. As a regional supervisor, I provided coordination, workload prioritization, and oversight of adaptive aquatic habitat and species conservation management activities for permanent and term employees within the 16 counties of Southeast Missouri. While serving in this capacity, I was asked by our agency leadership to participate in a council that was being initiated to create an organizational structure that would enable our agency to be more prepared to tackle the major conservation challenges of the future. The proposed structure was ultimately adopted and resulted in organizational structure changes for the agency. Our resource branches were aligned, our positions were more streamlined, and additional opportunities were created to enhance staff promotional opportunities. As Director for Inclusion and Diversity, I created an agency roadmap that was intended to enhance inclusion across our divisions and teams, while improving our ability to reach and provide access to all of our citizens. I provided leadership and direction in developing, implementing, and managing strategic initiatives. I also provided oversight and was responsible for ongoing operations pertaining to planning, goal setting, measurement development, progress monitoring, action plan development, and performance. I served as an advisor, a bridge builder, a strategic leader and partner, enabling our leaders across the agency to identify and execute initiatives to effect lasting organizational change. I also ensured inclusive messaging at all levels of the agency and identified internal and external training opportunities for staff development. While advancing through various fisheries research, management, supervisory, and agency leadership positions, my efforts have been focused on designing transformational organizational change, researching and preserving natural resources, and maintaining effective relationships with the public, landowners, state and federal agencies, counties, and non-governmental organizations. Throughout my career, I've demonstrated a passion for communicating, innovating, and leading. I've also been acknowledged for my capacity to build enthusiasm, the talents of others, identify key issues, shape key partnerships, and work with the necessary resources available to meet budget while achieving organizational objectives. The Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks mission is to conserve and enhance Kansas wildlife and habitats, ensure current and future generations appreciate and enjoy these living resources and associated recreation while informing the public of the status of the Kansas natural resources. Since I began my appointment as acting secretary for the Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks, my team and I have identified several opportunities for improvement within the agency. Our initial focus areas have included fiscal responsibility, increasing internal communication, improving agency public awareness, and assessment of our infrastructure across the state. Thus far, we have worked with the Department of Administration to improve our internal budgeting procedures, fiscal staff organizational structure, and procurement protocols. As secretary, I will continue to strive to identify efficiencies, inspire teamwork, and improve the agency's long-term sustainability. Although serving and managing fish, wildlife, parks, our citizens, and our visitors has always been and will remain at the forefront of my mind. I am privileged to have the opportunity to serve the people of Kansas, and I look forward to working with my Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks team to tackle the challenges of the future. I would like to thank you all, and I'm happy to address any questions that you all may have.
Thank you very much. Do we have any questions?
Thanks very much for being here and for sharing with us your background in the area of wildlife and parks, particularly on the Missouri side. I was just curious as I was looking through your achievements, and you mentioned about being a guest on National Geographic Monster Fish and Animal Planet's River Monsters. So how did that deal? You said it was episodes that featured alligator gar, and so I just thought maybe you could expand on that a little bit. It's just
It is my pleasure to do so. You almost sent chills up and down my spine when you talk about alligator gar. When I came to Missouri, alligator gar is even nationally, was a hated fish species across the nation. In fact, in the early 1900s, people would go out on these excursions to kill alligator gar wherever they found them. In fact, in some states, it was actually a law that if an alligator gar was caught, it had to be killed. And this disdain for the species truly revolved around the way the species looked. It's not very cuddly or furry. It's slimy, it's got a lot of teeth, and it almost reminds you of an alligator. And And, um, and so, you know, but I always recognize that the ecological niche that alligator serve for our fish communities and our river ecosystems was a very important niche that needed to be served. And I started doing research on alligator gar. I started looking at all the other research that had been conducted across the nation. We did a literature review, and there was very little done on alligator gar. And so I was one of the first in the nation to really embark on a variety of research projects that made the public and our agency more aware of that ecological niche that I was referring to earlier. Very fun project. I was privileged to be able to serve the alligator gar, serve our citizens, ultimately gained the support of our agency and the public. Had to go to many a public meeting to get the approval. But at the end of the day, they all agreed. And we ultimately restocked alligator gar back in the Mississippi River basin. They are still thriving. We have some fish in Missouri now that are well over 150 pounds. When I stocked them, they were about that small. And eventually, the people started to change. And I mean, it wasn't really due to me, but just across the nation, the way they perceived the species. And there was a lot more interest in what the role of that species was. And at Animal Planet and National Geographic, they decided to do those shows, and they started looking at, well, who's done the most research? Well, if you want to do the most research, you pick the species that everybody hates, and you'll typically end up number one. And so I ended up with a phone call from both of those organizations to participate in those shows, and great fun, great project, and I'm very proud of that work that I was able to do there with the alligator gar in Missouri.
I guess that's the way we all learn, from someone that spends time researching to find a value for a species, just as the alligator gar. I'm not sure I've seen an alligator gar. I've seen a gar fish, and I think they are, just as you say, very ugly and have lots of teeth. And the first time I saw it, when my husband was a fisherman, it's like I couldn't understand why anybody would see a value in him. So I appreciate that you're bringing that forward to us.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Senator Wilburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and may I call you Chris?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I appreciate you driving out to McPherson. We had a wonderful discussion. One of my lifelong loves is outdoor life, a lifetime hunting license, and my constituents are really strong in that area. We had a wonderful discussion about Kansas, the shortfall in the pheasants, and I thoroughly enjoyed that discussion. We also had a frank discussion about your leadership in the DEI role, and that would be a hot topic, and would like to have you address that a little bit.
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. A lot of controversy around those three letters, right? DEI. And I think the source of that controversy depends on your interpretation of those three letters. In the state of Missouri, we were fortunate in that all of our citizens provided revenue sources for our agency, and we have an obligation to serve every one of them. And so our goal, we didn't call it DEI in Missouri, we called it inclusion and diversity. And I think if you look throughout the history of this nation, that's where we've truly struggled, is being inclusive with one another. That's not only been a struggle for our nation, it's a struggle in conservation agencies too. Many conservation agencies historically have separated themselves according to their disciplines: fisheries, forestry, wildlife. They never sit together. They always sit on opposite ends of the room. And so as we embark on this new age of ecological management, it takes all disciplines to be at the table for fair representation. And that was our first goal, was to ensure that our divisions, our teams were working effectively across the table to assess the conservation issues of the future. The other part of that, it was to ensure that our staff were ready to go out and reach anybody within the state, no matter their color, no matter their creed, how they identify, no matter what their partisanship is. In my eyes, it really doesn't matter. We've got to, as responsible advocates for fish and wildlife, we've got to be prepared to reach across the board to all of our citizens. And so it was my job to ensure that our staff were capable and ready to go tackle that challenge.
Thank you for being with us. And I know Missouri is very different in their conservation, but what do you think the biggest challenge for Parks and Rec in Kansas is?
I've only been here since the end of March, but since that time, I've really been in investigation mode. Missouri is very different. It's probably one of the most well-funded agencies, well-staffed agencies within the nation. And so I was exposed to a variety of progressive management tactics in that state that they were just afforded to do because of the resources that they had. When I think about Kansas and where we are today, we've identified really three major areas where I think we would at least like to begin work. And one of those areas we've already started. It just couldn't wait. And number one is being fiscally responsible. We have to have an agency. Part of the goal is to ensure that we have fish and wildlife and resources available to our citizens, not only for us, but also for our children. And so we've got to ensure the fiscal sustainability of the agency. After working with Division of Administration, I'm really thankful for them and their staff, Adam Prophet. They've been working with our staff. We've taken a hard look at our protocols for our budgeting protocols. We've implemented new internal controls. We have also changed the way that our staff justify their budgets. And in fact, we've gone to zero-based budgeting, which has been very helpful. I believe in transparency and effective criticism. Nobody likes to be criticized, but I truly believe that internally, as we criticize each other, specifically as it pertains to our budget, it'll help us become more transparent into the future. It will also ensure that we're creating a product that's worthy of our citizens. And so that was one of the major areas where, as I said, we just couldn't wait. We also changed the structure within our, based on the advice from Division of Administration, we changed our structure within our fiscal side of the agency. We take in a lot of grant funds, and so it's really a good thing that our federal aid section would be a part of our fiscal section, and we created additional positions in procurement to ensure that protocols are followed into the future. And so that's the fiscal piece. The other thing that we've spent a lot of time working on is communication. As you all are aware, we have staff all across the state. We've got 9 different offices strategically positioned within the state, and all of them are very important. But we felt like there was a need to enhance our ability to communicate with staff from leadership all the way down to our field staff. And so we've implemented communication protocols and meetings that will help make that communication possible. And so far, the last piece I'd like to cover is engagement. I came from a state whose citizens truly saw the value of conservation and the work that we were doing in Missouri, and they showed it regularly. They showed it so much, I wouldn't go to Walmart with my uniform on. And it wasn't because I was worried about having negative interactions. The interactions were very positive, but they'd hold you there for a good 2-3 hours talking about the things that they liked about conservation, the things that they liked about the agency. And so, you know, in Missouri, our citizens really look favorably upon our conservation agency, and I think that's allowed them the benefit in resources. And so when I think about engagement, where we are in Kansas, I think we've got a lot of work to do. I think there are still a lot of citizens that don't know what we do, or they think we just ride around in 4-wheel drive trucks and give people tickets, which is nothing could be further from the truth. We've got a lot of excellent staff, talented staff with great expertise, and we'll continue to rely on them, but I definitely want to push in the area and how we engage the public, how we engage the legislature. I think all of those pieces are necessary if we hope to continue to maintain the resources that we need to promote fish and wildlife within the state of Kansas.
Any other questions? Senator Bellinger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for being here today. I also want to thank you for driving to Mountain Time. That's how far he came out to visit with me. So anyway, we had a good visit. I just want to give you an opportunity to some of the questions that I had asked you earlier to present them to the whole committee. You know, you mentioned change. You mentioned improvements. You talked about efficiencies and communication and so forth. So here's a couple of questions. You know, one, you're new at the agency in Kansas, and how are you gathering adequate information about the history of the agency and the strength and the needs of our resources and constituents and the culture of conservation to make the right kind of decisions for the folks in Kansas?
Thank you for the question, Senator Bellinger. I think the example that we talked about with fiscal and those quick changes that we had to make to improve the fiscal position of the department is a good example for that. I first investigated. I asked and I had my staff ask a lot of questions about procurement, about our budget in general, most of which probably made some uncomfortable, the level of questions that we were asking. And I think that's a necessary first step, investigate. Secondly, once we identified a host of issues, I didn't go in my office and close the door and make the decision on my own. I called in all of our fiscal staff across all the state. We met in Topeka, and we had about a series of 5 different meetings. And these are all-day meetings. And I essentially laid the issues out. And not only issues that were identified in an audit or in a Department of Administration assessments, we also identified and uncovered different perceptions that the legislature, that Department of Administration has about our agency and our ability to manage our funds. And so I called all those staff in. I laid those issues out on the table. I laid those perceptions out on the table. And I had them come up with the solutions. And so we took a very team approach to resolving those fiscal issues that we had. And that's truly my style of management. I don't feel like I have to or need to make any of these decisions on my own. I use the talents and the experiences of those around me and those that are in positions that are responsible, in this case, for our fiscal activities. We bring them in the room and we hash it out. I have them create the solutions. And then I create the expectation that we like criticism. I want them to criticize our projects. I want them to criticize our solutions. I want them to criticize me. And like I said earlier, I think that level of scrutiny and that process will allow us to produce the best products that we can for Kansas citizens.
Another item you and I discussed was, there was some worry about, we're based all across the state and about possibly moving people from Hutchinson or wherever to Topeka. And, I guess I'll start with this. What positions are essential to be based in Topeka and which can be equally or better served from other offices? How have you come to the determination if you are proposing or not proposing to move people? They may have kids that are in school that want to, graduate in 3 years with all their classmates. I mean, there's a lot of issues when you talk about uprooting people and moving them. And will the positions that have been based in other locations continue to have the option to be based outside of Topeka? Or will you be basing new hires in Topeka? So explain to us this concern that the folks have at other offices about
Thank you for
moving.
that question. It was a multifaceted question. I should have been taking notes. I'll try to answer as effectively as I can, and please feel free to ask any follow-up questions that you may need. As I said earlier, we've got 9 different offices that are strategically placed around the state. All of those offices and staff in those offices have functions that allow us to facilitate the management of fish and wildlife and engage with the public. I haven't embarked on any conversations where I've talked about moving anybody from any of their current positions to Topeka, no matter the office. Although when you ask the question, what positions do I feel like are appropriately based here in Topeka, I definitely think that most of your leadership positions should be here. Now, there is a situation where we have some positions, leadership positions that are in some offices, and those are typically positions that revolve around operations. And so I think it would be important to keep those positions there to oversee the operations. That's where most of our operations are headquartered out of. I had a variety of positions that I needed to refill upon coming here, and these are all leadership positions. They are positions that weren't filled when I arrived, and we're talking about our attorney, our public affairs chief, our CFO. All of those are positions that are very strategic in nature and require that our administrative team work effectively together as a team. Working in the same office, it makes it easier to accomplish that goal. But I have no desire to disrupt our staff's lives. I honestly feel like when I think about coming from Missouri, and we talked about the vast amount of resources that we had in Missouri, I'm honestly pretty amazed at our staff. And when you see them, I would hope that you would give them a pat on the back. They're kind of underappreciated. But when I think about and I look at the long list of things that they're able to complete for fish and wildlife and for the citizens of the state, these are pretty passionate people and they deserve to be treasured themselves. It's probably our greatest resource here in Kansas is our staff. And so I have no desire to disrupt that with a reorganization that will cause people to move their families, their homes to another location. I personally have lived through reorganizations and they were, that required people to move and they were somewhat disruptive. And so I would think very carefully about creating an atmosphere where we had that much disruption, especially if it influences the amount of work that we get done for our citizens.
One last question.
Yes, sir.
And this has to do with our non-government organizations. Numerous NGOs who partner with the Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks have reached out with a significant concern regarding the suspension of habitat, land and water projects that have already been approved and are underway. They have not received any explanation or timeline from Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks and are concerned that the projects may not be completed, that their investments will be lost, that the federal grant funds may have to be repaid, and they are concerned about the negative impacts that this will have on our resources, our hunters, and their conservation initiatives. Can you explain the lack of communication on these projects?
I don't know if I would say a lack of communication on those projects. We're currently going through our budget submission process and we're putting together our budgets for the legislature. And we require new justification protocols for many of our leaders within the agency. Now, roughly about 35 to 39% of our budget comes from our fees. The remainder of our budget comes from grant funding, and we accomplish a lot of good work by working with many of those NGOs, the Nature Conservancy, the Wildlife Federation, Pheasants Forever, groups like these who have allowed us to advance wildlife habitat across the state. I have required that our staff become unified in the way that we look at our grant funding. A lot of the coordination was poor when it came to our grant funding within the agency. I think that's one of the issues, or one of the issues last year with our budget. Things weren't quite matching up. Now, I wasn't here, but the left hand, as it pertains to grant funding, the left hand was not talking to the right hand within the agency. And so we had to implement protocols that ensure that communication, which required our staff provide additional justifications on why we should continue projects. I can't comment at this point on what projects we're going to continue forward with, what projects are we cutting back on. We're still going through that process as we speak, as we prepare our budgets. Although I can say those projects where it is truly enhancing our ability to manage our infrastructure, enhance our ability to put good habitat on the ground for fish and wildlife, we'd like to keep those moving forward. And so I don't think within my administration you'll see me turning away from those resources that make good habitat management feasible within the state of Kansas.
Thank you for your answers today.
Thank you.
Senator Masterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here, Chris. And yeah, seems like I heard more about you than anybody else on this docket. But
I hope that's good.
yeah, well, people are confused, I think. So the two, I just picked two of the complaints that I heard, or not complaints, I guess questions I had around you. One of them's around feral hogs. I've got guys contacting. What are your thoughts around controlling that population in Kansas? I've got guys in southeast Kansas, and well, a lot of my agriculture guys, they're just being destroyed by them. Wanted to get your thoughts on hunting.
Absolutely. Federal hogs are an issue, and I came from a state where they were a major issue all across the state. And truly, it's working hand in hand with the Department of Agriculture, working hand in hand with our landowners to implement projects to help eradicate hogs wherever we find them. And it is necessary because they demolish habitat wherever they go, whether you're talking about aquatic habitat or terrestrial habitat. But I think it's cooperative initiatives that would allow us to be successful in that arena. We're fortunate here. They're not across the whole state and in isolated pockets. And so while it is a concern, it's something we need to be focused on and ensuring that those feral hogs populations don't continue to expand. I think it's a much easier scenario to deal with than where I came from in Missouri. The terrain is totally different. Definitely harder to trap or isolate and kill hogs on the landscapes. It's a little bit easier here in the land of big sky here in Kansas.
So the second one that I've heard about was, and I don't understand, was there a regulation imposed recently or being talked about around boats and fire extinguishers? And well, I've got some people concerned about that, right? That's going to cost our boat owners.
Absolutely. Good question, and thank you for it. Yes, our attorney, we typically have a propagation process. It's pretty lengthy. But we recently proposed a regulation that requires boat owners within the state of Kansas to change out their fire extinguishers after a 12-year period. This was not a regulation that we came up on our own. This regulation came from the Coast Guard. By the way, we receive a lot of grant funding from the Coast Guard, and so not aligning our regulations with the Coast Guard could impact the funding that we receive from the grant funding that we receive from the Coast Guard. So that's number one. You a boat owner?
Was.
It was.
Favorite
Were.
day you bought one, the favorite day you sold it, right?
I've been a boat owner for most of my adult life. My father was a boat owner. My grandfather was a boat owner. I don't know if any of you all have actually seen a boat catch fire and what that means if you don't have a fire extinguisher on that boat. Part of our job is to ensure the safety of our citizens as they utilize the resources that they have available to them. Having a fire extinguisher that works is very, very important. And I didn't decide what works, what doesn't work. On most fire extinguishers, if you read the label, there's a 12-year limit on that label. Now, I'm a label follower. Whether I'm spraying chemicals, we should read the label. If we're utilizing fire extinguishers, we should read the label. I'm frankly glad that it came up because I've had my boat for almost 15 years, and guess what? I got to go out and buy a new fire extinguisher. But I feel like that's a small cost to pay. What does that cost? We're talking about $35, $36 per fire extinguisher. And I understand that that's real money, and it impacts our citizens. They will have to pay that additional. But if you look at it over a 12-year span, we're talking about $3 per year for our boat owners to ensure that they're safe as they recreate on the water. I think it's very important. Being the first to go through that process as regulatory expectations or changes, regulatory expectations are changing, it was a little bit difficult, but it allowed us to go back and just refine the way that we present our regulations to the committee. And I think we've responded appropriately in creating those arguments and the justifications for moving forward with that regulation. But I would sincerely hope that over my term, our ability to implement regulations becomes somewhat easier. That's the only way that we manage fish and wildlife across the state. And we'll go out and we'll do these biological surveys to assess the condition of any given wildlife population, and there's a time frame from which we have to get a regulation in place, and so that we can protect the critters that we're trying to protect. And if we're unable to do that, if it takes an extended time to push regulations through, the conditions on the ground with monitoring those various species could change, which means the regulation could potentially change. So the timeliness in which we're able to get regulations through and moving forward is very important as far as our agency is concerned.
I think the concern I was hearing, right, so how many boats are registered that are over 12 years old, right? So how many thousands of boats have to come up with the $36? And so does that regulation then impose what's the number, right, our citizens are going to have to come up with to do that? And I think that one probably rises to the new regulation statute we have that, just need to make sure you guys are aware that when you're imposing a cost on the population, even though it's, for us, $3 a year, right? But it's $36 over how many thousands of boats. And, am I imposing a $1.5 million regulation onto the population that rises to a level that might need to have some review from others, I think what I was hearing. So that were some of the concerns, but thank you.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? Chris, I've got a couple. We continue to get questions coming in, and these came in this morning. One was Kansas statute gives the secretary eminent domain authority. And when do you believe that it's necessary to use that authority for the good of the public and Kansas wildlife and parks? Would you be willing to exercise that authority to expand hunting and fishing, camping, and other opportunities here in Kansas to increase the number of acres available for public use? What would you use that authority for? That was the question.
Oh, I think you hit the nail on the head, Senator Alley. I mean, my first goal is to protect fish, wildlife of the state for the citizens and to educate and allow or give our citizens access to the resources needed to recreate. When I think about public resources, they are far and few between here in the state of Kansas, especially as we get on the eastern side of the state where our populations are high, our public resources are very low. And so if I found myself in a position where we could promote obtaining more public lands for public use, I would definitely be in favor for it. But it's a team sport. I mean, yes, there are certain authorities that are allowed to me, but when I think about conservation as a whole, it's not on one individual. The legislature has to work in that process. Our governor works within that process. The people, our staff, all should be engaged in that process to decide what's appropriate. I know what I would promote, and I recognize what I would try to push forward. I see a lot of citizens that just don't have the areas that they would like to go hunt, and there's a definite conflict there. And so I'm a common man, and I'm looking out for the common man. I think within our Constitution, every citizen has the right to hunt and fish within this state. And I would do everything I could to ensure that they've got the opportunities to do so.
Another question that came in this morning was parts of Kansas are basically being overrun by deer. Did you ask that question earlier? You talked about hogs, okay. Well, they're overrun by deer. And I know that I've got several farmers in my area that are complaining about the deer population getting into their crops, and they are destroying a lot of their crops. And it's cost the farmers a lot of money. What would you be willing to do? Would you be able to what recommendation would you have to maybe stop this overpopulation of the deer population?
Thank you for the question, Senator Alley. I would like to respectfully disagree. I don't feel like, and it's not just based on my feelings, we're looking at research. We've got a team of biologists that monitors our deer populations across the state. And I definitely don't feel like their opinion would be that deer populations are, out of control within the state of Kansas. And quite honestly, when it's different depending on what part of the state you look at. If you look at the western side of Kansas, deer populations are not increasing; they're decreasing, and we're wondering about ways to improve that scenario. As you move east, the numbers of deer definitely go up. I recently had a meeting with the Farm Bureau where I met with a group of farmers to talk about, and I had our biologists on staff to talk about those issues. So the first step would be to educate. What is the status of our deer population, and share that information and be transparent there. The other side of that is helping farmers solve their issues. And we talked about, our biologists talked about several deterrents that could be used within agriculture to deter deer predation on their beans or the crops that they're producing at the time. And so I think there's room where we can work together on those issues. That would be my goal, and work with landowners with isolated issues with deer problems to help discourage the deer from feeding on the crops that they're trying to grow.
Well, thank you for that answer. I do have several more questions. However, we've been receiving questions today more than from other of our colleagues. And with that, I believe that there's still questions that haven't been answered. And so I'd like to adjourn this meeting, and then within 10 days, come back and we'll do a virtual meeting within 10 days and make a recommendation at that time. So At this time, I move that we adjourn this meeting, and then we will reconvene within 10 days and we'll do a virtual meeting, and we'll get invitation out to you on that one for that. There are still, like I say, there's still questions coming in. Received those some this morning, and we have not been able to go through all those yet. So we appreciate you being here today. We will be back in touch and set up that meeting within 10 days. Thank you very much. Yes.
Just a question on that. I feel like I'm in a position where I can make a recommendation to send this to the Senate because we then have 40 senators who will vote on this hopefully in January. And I guess my question is, since this is not kind of like the official, like this still goes before the full Senate, what is the concern?
We have questions that, like I say, I just received this morning, from our colleagues both in the House and the Senate. And there are other questions that have been raised that we would like to go through before we bring them back. And we can do this virtually. We don't have to have another meeting. We do appreciate you being here today in person. And we will do that again in 10 days. We'll set up that meeting. So at this point, we will adjourn this meeting at this time, and then we will call back, reconvene within that 10-day period. So thank you very much. This meeting is adjourned.